Welcome back to Investing Talk Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about Microchip Technology, ticker symbol MCHP. A company that's, it's been kind of a wild ride recently and a major player in the world of microcontrollers and analog semiconductors. But they've faced some headwinds lately, like many in the tech sector.
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation. You've got a company with a stock price that's been down quite a bit over the last year, but there are some glimmers of hope that are popping up that suggest maybe a turnaround could be in the works.
Okay, so let's start with that wild ride you just mentioned.
Yeah.
What's the story with MCHP's recent stock performance?
Well, over the past year, MCHP's stock has fallen about 33.8%.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a pretty steep drop, even considering how volatile tech stocks can be. And it's a long way from their all-time highs back in 2021 and 2023.
That's a significant drop, to say the least. But you mentioned some positive signs recently.
I did. In the past month, the stock has actually climbed by about 12%. It kind of indicates a renewed interest in the company and maybe a shift in sentiment.
Interesting. So we've got this contrast, a long-term downtrend, but a recent upswing. What's driving that recent bump?
Well, it's not really tied to any particular good news. In fact, their Q3 2025 earnings, which came out back in February, missed analysts' estimates.
Oh.
Yeah. They reported weaker than expected revenue and kind of soft demand, and their outlook for Q4 was pretty cautious.
It doesn't sound like the kind of news that usually makes the stock price go up. What happened?
Yeah, so initially the stock did dip right after the earnings were released, falling to about $49.50 after hours.
Okay.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, the stock has actually rebounded since then and is currently trading around $58.81.
So the market initially reacted negatively to the news, but then kind of changed its mind. What could explain that?
Well, there are a few things that might be going on here. One factor is there have been some analyst upgrades. Companies like Mizuho, Evercore ISI, Jefferies, and B. Riley have either raised their price targets or they've maintained positive ratings on MCHP.
Are those analysts just being overly optimistic, though? What's making them so bullish on MCHP right now?
Well, they're seeing some signs that order bookings are improving, and they think a recovery could be on the horizon. However, it's important to remember that this optimism, it actually contrasts with the struggles that are going on in the broader analog semiconductor segment. Even industry giants like Texas Instruments and NXP Semiconductors are having a really tough time right now.
So MCHP is getting this positive attention from analysts, even though the overall sector is facing challenges. Interesting. What else should we be looking at here?
Well, another key development is MCHP's recently announced restructuring plan. They're closing a facility and cutting about 2,000 jobs.
That sounds like a difficult decision. How's that being perceived?
Well, it's actually being seen as a potential positive. Investors are kind of interpreting this restructuring as a proactive step to, tackle their inventory issues and reduce their costs. They're aiming to save about $90 million annually by mid-2026.
So they're tightening their belt and becoming more efficient. That makes sense in this kind of economic climate. How did the market react to the news?
The stock actually jumped 2.35% in pre-market trading right after the announcement.
Wow.
Yeah, so at least initially it seems like investors are viewing this restructuring as a sign of strength, not weakness.
So far we've seen some mixed signals, disappointing earnings report, positive analyst sentiment, and a restructuring plan that's being seen as a potential positive. How do we make sense of all of this?
Well, to add another layer here, let's look at some of the technical indicators for MCHP. They might give us some additional clues about market sentiment and how the price might move in the future.
Okay, let's dive into those technicals. What are the charts telling us about MCHP?
Well, one key indicator is what's called the 50-day simple moving average, or 50-day SMA. This is a line that represents the average closing price of stock over the past 50 days. It helps us to identify short-term trends. And right now, MCHP's price is slightly above its 50-day SMA, which is generally a bullish signal.
Okay, so short-term momentum might be shifting in favor of the bulls, but what about the longer-term picture?
Well, if we look at the 200-day SMA, which is the average price over the past 200 days, we can see that MCHP is still trading well below that line. So that suggests that the longer-term downtrend might still be in play.
So we've got this tension between short-term bullishness and longer-term uncertainty. Are there any other technical indicators we should be looking at?
Yeah. The Relative Strength Index, or RSI, is another tool that can be really helpful. This measures the magnitude of recent price changes to evaluate overbought or oversold conditions. Right now, MCHP's RSI is in a fairly neutral zone, meaning it's not really sending any strong buy or sell signals. So we need to look at other factors to figure out the likely direction.
Okay, that makes sense. What about key support and resistance levels? What should we be watching for there?
The $55 to $56 zone seems to be providing some support for the stock, meaning we might see buying activity around those levels if the price dips. On the other hand, $60 and then $65, those are resistance levels. These are price points where we might see selling pressure as investors start to take profits. But if MCHP can break above those resistance levels and do so with significant volume, it could be a strong sign that the buyers are truly in control.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving pieces here, making it really tough to get a clear read on MCHP. To help put things in perspective, can you talk about the example of NVIDIA that we discussed earlier?
Absolutely. NVIDIA just absolutely crushed earnings expectations thanks to the just huge demand for their AI chips. And this really highlights the fact that the semiconductor sector isn't monolithic. Some companies are doing incredibly well, while others are facing a lot of challenges.
So MCHP's challenges aren't necessarily a sign of a broader industry downturn. They're dealing with their own specific problems.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to look at individual companies and really understand the specific forces that are driving their performance, rather than just making generalizations about the entire sector.
So after all this, what are some of the key things listeners should be watching for in the coming weeks and months when it comes to MCHP?
There are a few crucial indicators that could really signal if MCHP is genuinely turning things around, or if this recent upswing is just a temporary blip. The first and most important thing is to keep an eye on their Q4 2025 earnings report. That's due out in May. Will they beat expectations and show that a recovery is actually happening?
So Q4 earnings will be a big test. What else should investors be paying attention to?
Those key resistance levels we talked about, $60 and then $65, are really important. If MCHP can break above those levels convincingly, that would signal growing strength. And of course, we'll want to continue monitoring what the analysts are saying. Will they maintain those positive outlooks? Or will they start to waver if the recovery isn't as fast as they're expecting?
Okay, so we've taken a pretty good look at the financials, the technical indicators, all that.
Yeah.
But let's kind of shift gears a little bit and really delve into what Microchip Technology actually does. You mentioned that they're a major player in microcontrollers and analog semiconductors. Can you break that down a little bit for listeners who might not be super familiar with those terms? What are those and why do they matter?
Sure. Let's start with microcontrollers. Basically, you can think of them as tiny little computers, like a whole computer on a single chip. They're kind of the brains behind so many of the devices that we use every day, everything from your coffee maker to your washing machine to more complicated systems like the entertainment system in your car or even industrial robots. They control functions, they process data, and they make decisions based on input that they get from sensors and other components.
So it's super essential for a lot of the devices that we kind of take for granted, it sounds like. What makes Microchip Technology stand out, though, in this really crowded microcontroller market? What are their strengths?
Well, Microchip is known for having this really broad range of microcontrollers, which means they can cater to a lot of different needs and applications. They also have a really strong reputation for reliability and performance, which is obviously important. And in today's world, where everything is getting more and more interconnected, security is a huge concern. Embedded security is absolutely essential. And Microchip has a really strong focus on that as well. They also provide a great ecosystem of software tools and support, which makes it easier for developers to actually design and implement these systems.
That's great. Sounds like they've built a really strong foundation in the microcontroller market. Now let's talk about analog semiconductors. What are those exactly, and how do they fit into this tech-driven world that we live in?
Analog semiconductors are basically the bridge between the real world, which is analog, and the digital world of all our computers and electronics. They're responsible for things like amplifying signals, converting between analog and digital formats, managing power, and regulating voltage. You can kind of think of them as the intermediaries that allow electronic devices to actually interact with and understand the physical world around them.
Okay, so can you give us some examples to kind of make that a little more concrete?
Absolutely. Analog semiconductors are in just about everything. Smartphones, audio equipment, medical devices, industrial sensors, you name it. For example, in a smartphone, they handle things like the touch screen, the wireless communication, audio processing, battery management, all sorts of things. In medical devices, they might be used to amplify signals from sensors that are monitoring a patient's vital signs. They're everywhere.
Wow, that is fascinating. So how does Microchip's presence in the analog semiconductor market actually complement their microcontroller business? Is there any synergy there?
Oh, absolutely. There's a really powerful synergy going on. It's kind of like this. Microcontrollers provide the intelligence, they're the brains making the decisions, while the analog semiconductors handle the interface with the real world, capturing data and controlling actions. Having both of those under one roof allows Microchip to offer these really integrated solutions, which is particularly important for applications where you need seamless signal processing and everything has to be really tightly integrated.
So essentially, they're like a one-stop shop for a lot of electronics manufacturers. They get the brains and the sensory input-output capabilities all in one place. But even with this really strong foundation, they haven't been completely immune to the challenges that are facing the semiconductor industry as a whole, right?
Right, exactly. Like a lot of their peers, Microchip has definitely been impacted by things like the global chip shortage, the fact that demand has weakened recently, and just all this general macroeconomic uncertainty that's out there. But as we've seen, they're not just sitting around waiting for things to get better. Their restructuring plan, although it's painful in the short term, is a sign that they're trying to adapt and position themselves for future growth.
Yeah, it seems like they're taking a really proactive approach to navigate these kind of turbulent times.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that the semiconductor industry is cyclical. You're always going to have these periods of boom and bust. The real key for companies like Microchip is to manage those cycles effectively, making smart investments during the good times and being resilient enough to weather the storm when things inevitably slow down.
So we've covered a ton of ground here about Microchip technology, their stock performance, their business, the challenges they face. What are some key questions investors should be asking themselves when they're evaluating this company?
Well, the biggest question is this. Is Microchip a bargain at its current price, or are the risks just too high compared to the potential rewards? And remember, just because a stock's price is down doesn't automatically mean it's a good investment. You got to look beyond the price tag and really consider the company's fundamentals, its growth prospects, and its ability to navigate this, kind of tricky economic environment.
That's good advice. What are some specific things investors should be thinking about when trying to answer that question?
Well, you really need to weigh the negative signals, things like the weak Q3 earnings and that cautious guidance for Q4, against the positive factors like the analyst upgrades and the potential benefits of the restructuring.
Yeah, a lot to think about for sure. What key takeaways should listeners walk away with today?
Well, first of all, don't panic and make rash decisions based on fear or short-term market swings. Investing is a marathon, not a sprint. And even really strong companies go through rough patches.
So patience is key.
Absolutely. Second, do your homework. Understand Microchip's business model, who they're competing with and what's driving their performance. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to investing.
So informed decision-making is really what we're talking about. What else?
Third, be realistic. Don't expect overnight miracles. Turnarounds take time, and so does building long-term wealth.
And it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to investing. What might be a great opportunity for one person could be way too risky for someone else.
Exactly. Every investor has their own unique financial goals, their own tolerance for risk, and their own investment strategy. The key is to find investments that align with your personal circumstances. And of course, diversify to manage risk.
Okay, so we've explored some of the key factors that are shaping Microchip Technology's future. What final thoughts would you leave our listeners with today?
Investing in the stock market always involves some level of uncertainty. But by carefully looking at all the evidence that's available, considering both the risks and the potential rewards, and making informed decisions that fit your own individual situation, you can navigate this really complex world and hopefully achieve your financial goals.
So it sounds like Microchip Technology is kind of at a crossroads right now. There are definitely some challenges, but there are also some potential opportunities. For those investors out there who might be considering Microchip Technology, what are some of the things they should really be thinking about?
Well, whenever you're evaluating a potential investment, it's crucial to really dig into the specifics. What are the company's core products and services? Who are their main competitors? And how are they positioned in the market overall?
Right. So let's start with Microchip's core products. They're known for these microcontrollers and these analog semiconductors. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific applications of those technologies?
Sure. Microchips microcontrollers, they're used in a really vast array of applications. Think about the Internet of Things, all those smart devices that are connected to the Internet. A lot of those rely on Microchip's technology. You'll find their microcontrollers in things like industrial automation, automotive systems, consumer electronics, all sorts of things.
Okay. And what about the analog semiconductors? Where do those fit in?
Analog semiconductors are really crucial for interfacing between the digital world and the physical world. They're used in power management, signal conversion, and a ton of different sensing applications. I mean, think about things like touchscreens, wireless communication, even the sensors that monitor your heart rate on your fitness tracker.
So basically, they're essential components in so much of the technology that we use every single day. It sounds like Microchip has a pretty diverse product portfolio, but who are their main competitors in these markets?
Yeah, Microchip operates in a really competitive landscape. They're going up against some big players, like Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, NXP Semiconductors. Each of these companies has its own strengths and weaknesses, so it's important to understand how Microchip differentiates itself from the competition.
What are some of Microchip's key competitive advantages?
Well, Microchips has built a really solid reputation for reliability, and they have a strong focus on embedded security, which is more and more important these days. They also have, as we said, a wide product portfolio and a really robust ecosystem of software tools and support, which makes it easier for engineers and developers to use their products.
It sounds like they've done a good job of cultivating a strong position in the market, but as we've discussed, they are facing some challenges. How are they addressing those?
Well, their restructuring plan is a big step. They're streamlining their operations, cutting costs, and really focusing on their most profitable product lines. They're also investing in some new technologies and markets, things like electric vehicles and renewable energy, where there's a lot of potential for growth.
Right, so they're not just standing still, they're adapting. For investors, I guess it's important to kind of monitor those efforts and assess whether they're going to be successful or not. What advice would you give to somebody who is considering investing in microchip technology?
Well, I would say, first and foremost, do your research. Don't just rely on headlines or what some analyst is saying. Dig into the company's financial statements, read industry reports, follow their news and announcements. Try to really get a solid understanding of their business and their competitive position.
It's all about informed decision making. Investing is a long game, right? It's not about chasing those quick profits. It's about finding those companies with solid fundamentals and the potential for, real sustainable growth over time.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember there's always risk involved. No investment is a sure thing. You always want to diversify your portfolio. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, as they say.
That's great advice. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the specifics of Microchip's business and also some of the bigger trends that are shaping the entire semiconductor industry. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with today?
As we wrap up, I just want to encourage everyone to approach investing with a curious mind. Stay informed about the companies that you're interested in, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your money.
That's a great note to end on. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Investing Talk Podcast. And as always, if you're looking for more investing insights, be sure to subscribe to our channel, share this episode with your friends, and leave a comment below. Until next time, happy investing.